Welcome back. In part 2, we jump back in with a more controversial topic, that of Jan-Willem Lasch, and how his interpretation of the concept of Gnosticism has become intertwined with the Mandela Effect. We explore the question of whether or not conspiracy theories are dangerous to society, but also note their more playful quality as those old pranksters, the Discordians, revisit us. We then move on to the topic of memory that plays a huge role in the Mandela Effect, how memory affects history, how remembering something actually creates new experiences and can affect our future memories, and what the reward could possibly be for people who believe in the Mandela Effect. Aaron also shares some very interesting content regarding a possible pre-Mandela Effect, and we close with Aaron sharing some other information about his work as a writer and editor of fantasy fiction. Enjoy! Let's talk about another example of a ME conspiracy coming from, I guess this would be considered more the occultist viewpoint, and in particular, Jan-Willem Lasch. He's an author who came onto the scene in 2006 with his particular view regarding Gnosticism, which I found out recently that this has developed into something that I consider quite problematic as his ideas have changed. I mean, I was at a bookstore. I have the book right here. I was at the bookstore and saw this and thought, oh, this seems to be interesting. You know, I'm all about reading about religions and different ideas. Read this book back then and thought, well, yeah, okay, he's making an argument that, okay, Christianity is not really the best religion because it killed out paganism and just put it very, very, very simply and very bluntly. And you know, that, of course, he had that stance, okay, anti-Christian. But that's kind of where I thought it ended. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore, anyway, if it had been. So can you talk more about this?
Yeah, he's an interesting example, which relates to this New Age, the New Age interpretation and the biblical interpretation. Because one of the things I noticed that was interesting, and in my paper, I tried to argue that certain elements of Christian culture are being part of this cultic milieu now. And I guess we could say, as you mentioned at the beginning, that this partly because of the science, the dominance of scientific interpretation of events and reality and so forth. But you will get, and I've watched some of these very interesting dialogues between, like a podcast, for instance, between a predominantly New Agey person and one of these dispensationalists, we could say, or at least a red-pilled Christian, which I talk about in my paper. And they will have a podcast about something like the Mandela Effect and talk about it. And they agree with lots of points, but there's a certain point where they stop agreeing. And they're usually polite with it, but they are having a kind of dialogue, which I found sort of interesting to see New Age as if the scenario they paint is true, that science is sort of marginalizing something like spirituality more and more, then naturally these two would start to bump up against each other in this zone. So that's just to finish that. But to move on to Jan-Willem Lasch, the one thing I would want to say is there's a dissertation that came out recently from Rice by Matthew Dillon, and it's called The Heretical Library, the Nag Hammadi Library in American Religion and Culture. And it came out a couple of years ago. It's really good. And he goes into Jan-Willem Lasch's history with Gnosticism in there in a really good way. So I mentioned it briefly just because he popped into the Mandela Effect world for a little bit there.
Okay.
But he's an interesting case study, actually, that I think that ought to be more looked at, to be honest. And I think it's good that in this dissertation, they do talk about it. This gets into the problematics, we could say, of the Mandela Effect, but it's, in a certain sense, it's problematic of a larger event that's happening. And the way I would interpret it is, these preachers that I was just mentioning about are having these emotional videos. The state that you see them responding with is a kind of fight or flight feeling.
Yeah.
This is the way I would try to interpret the response to people having these experiences purely by stuff they're encountering online, which is an interesting phenomenon in and of itself. So if you look at, and when I was first researching this, this was the pre-Trump world, and things were different back then. But so it wasn't, people were not as freaked. The Christians sort of were, but there wasn't, as things escalated, particularly after the first election, it seemed like a lot more people in this community felt attacked, felt this kind of like, and seemed to come from a position of fight or flight. And this leads to like radicalization is the way I kind of see what's happening from just my own observation. I'm not really writing about it. So in his case, this also happened between those years in his thinking.
Okay.
And that's the way I would try to interpret what happened. At the same time, he is definitely the kind of person, in my opinion, who has had, he kind of speaks like a prophet, I guess, but he's definitely had, like, for him, legitimate spiritual experiences that the way he talks about it is that he is into this Gnosticism thing. He's a worshiper of Sophia. He's very against Christianity, as you mentioned. And he feels himself to have had an experience, a mystical experience, in which he came into contact with the goddess Sophia, who lives in the earth. So in his mind, he has this kind of meditative, almost shamanic is the way he talks about it, connection between the goddess Sophia and in the earth, and then himself. And then he can kind of he's like the conduit then for the Sophia. Yeah, that's just a little bit of background. There's a lot more one could say about him. But in terms of the Mandela effect, when I was researching this whole thing, he, at the same time, had come in contact with it. And then I can't even remember how I came across these, to be honest, but he started a whole series on YouTube, which is all taken down now. And again, because this is after Trump, but it still isn't into the realm of, their fake news was a thing, but fake news currently is a one, like I write a lot about these subjects, and lots of things get taken down off the internet all the time, the stuff that I research. Okay. Either it's the people themselves doing it because they're afraid, or a lot of times it's just being taken off because it's this dangerous fake news situation going on with the tech companies. So when I'm writing about this, it's really strange phenomenon to the stuff that I was citing and writing about just sort of vanishing. If you try to cite it, like the links that I put in my papers, I just had one come out about 5G and coronavirus. It's coming out soon. A lot of the links I used in that no longer working. So I have to then kind of rethink, how can I actually show people that this is what was going on? But so anyway, this whole series is now gone. I think he took it down himself though, and it sort of made something else out of it. But I also think he took it down because it started out in a certain way. Well, I think it started out radical as well, and got more so. So it's not something he would probably want to have out there at the same time, in the current situation. But to put it in a nutshell, which I talk about it in my paper, the Mandela effect, he interprets it as a kind of a racial awakening, I guess we would say, and that it's the goddess Sophia's return. He interprets a certain part of the Gnostic Gospels or the Nag Hammadi scripts as this Sophia's correction as a kind of endgame scenario for the Gnostics, in which Sophia returns to correct the problem of the fall from when Sophia fell, and then the demiurge was created and all this stuff. So for him, the people who recognize the Mandela effect and realize that it's wrong are sort of being pinged by Sophia to kind of wake up, basically, to notice the changes, to have their attention directed in a different way. So that's kind of his starting point, but that isn't where he stops, though. He then builds this whole other kind of vision, I guess, with it about why is she waking up? What is she trying to correct? Well, it's actually that the children of Sophia are the white people, or the Europeans, as he frequently talks about it, and that it's the white genocide trope, which most people are familiar with, that turns up here. And I don't think it was there prior to these years. This is something that came in later.
I don't recall it being there. I read we're talking about memory here, and how that's sometimes kind of faulty, but I don't recall him ever bringing up anything like this. So in the book from 2006. So
Yeah,
Okay.
and I would put this as part of this period of this sort of fight or flight radicalization that is ongoing. It's now, that's one of the ways I would try to think about that. But it's also a logical extension of his Gnosticism. And in the dissertation, this is what's pointed out, which is the problematic of Gnosticism, that it has these anti-Semitic, can have these anti-Semitic qualities and interpretations. So really, if you listen to the John Lamb Lash guy, the way he interprets the Gnostic scripts, he is logically following those interpretations to their conclusion. Like he's not in his own interpretation of it, he hasn't sort of deviated from there. He's like taking these ideas to their logical end, essentially in his own interpretation of them. But then that's mixed in with this all this conspiracy theory culture stuff that has been everywhere lately. But just to finish his view of this is the white genocide scenario is actually propagated by the archons and the demiurge, which is the faction, the Semitic faction of humanity. So he does describe this in terms of the Semitic element being this sort of alien archontic, and he describes them as a master race element, and that the white people, the Europeans, are the ones who are sort of responding to Sophia's awakening through this Mandela effect, and that the archontic who work through both Judaism and Christianity, because he sees Christianity as the sort of like, the global arm of Judaism in a certain sense. It's like has its roots in the Semitic religiosity, or something like that. And he's in this pagan Gnostic mode. So anyway, that's an area that you don't find a lot of stuff like that, to be honest, but you do find it sometimes, and you find it in him. So I'm not really sure what to say about that, other than it's an interesting, interesting part of it.
It's, when thinking about, you and I, when we study about things like this, we're always dissecting everything and looking at, looking at things. I'm confused as to how he is conflating Sophia and Gaia, as if they're the same entity. But then to think about just looking at the Gnostic thought, situated in a particular time period, what they were talking about, what they were arguing against. I just, not that I am an expert on this this particular topic, because I didn't know that Lash had these had this kind of change of thought over the years. I wasn't aware of this, but just on the just as a kind of a religious studies scholar thinking about, oh my God, there's so many holes in this. So it's, but that doesn't really seem to matter, I guess, when we're talking about conspiracy theories. Right.
That could be partly the way I presented his ideas, because I'm certainly not, I haven't read the book that you have. I knew of him. I knew of him because of, I studied Rudolf Steiner for my dissertation and Max Weber, and he used to be a Steiner person in New Mexico and then broke with them. I think over the Christian elements, because the anthroposophists have this sort of very, very Christian esotericism or something. But it could have been partly the way I presented his ideas. But I do also think that the reason why he's like brought up in this dissertation is to sort of show that the way he's interpreting the Nag Hammadi text is his own interpretation of them. It isn't like a scholarly. Right. At least it's not something accepted by the scholarly community on Gnosticism currently.
And then we get into stigmatized knowledge. So here we go.
And there he is. He's hanging with the whole party. He's right where he should be.
So it fits perfectly.
And that was an interesting element, because he is directly coming from this more esoteric. So I did want to put that in there. There are other people, esotericists, talking about this more in a new age mode. And this is 2012 has happened. We are at the next level of consciousness evolution, which is sort of what he's saying too. He just has this whole other narrative with it, but that now's the time to, wake up, something like that. Wake up your spiritual consciousness. That would be the more new agey light.
Is it still connected with this sacred ecology that he was talking about back then? Because that's kind of the what I remember anyway from his narrative then, was that Sophia was trying to awaken us to the sacredness of Gaia,
Right.
and that we should kind of look more towards pagan worldviews, pagan ideas, and that's basically more in line with Gnostic viewpoints than Christian viewpoints or Judaic viewpoints. I guess, of course, it is a polemic. You're arguing against a particular religion, and in his case, he's kind of thinking of Christianity and Judaism as kind of the same thing, even though they are not the same. But in any case, he is. I mean, I understand the polemics. I mean, there's always polemics, but this, to me, the way you're describing it in your article, this new kind of twist that he's put on things, I get this feeling of like, gross.
Right.
I'm like, oh man, this is, don't like it.
And it's a twist that's been put on a lot of things, actually. So this is why one of the big problems, I mean, in the United States, this is, everywhere, but in the United States, the thing on January 6th and all of this, the Q thing that I talk about at the end, it isn't like it's just this person who went into this mode of feeling of attacked and then kind of radicalizing. So that's the way I would try to understand it. He is still talking about this, what you described, the sacred ecology, and in fact, it's the technology. And this is true for the other groups too. It's the technology that it's this evil, and this goes back to I write about this in my dissertation at the beginning of the 20th century. That technology being connected with these anti-human, anti-nature. It's like the romantics, or something. Anti-nature, anti-spirit forces.
And it seems to have taken on a very dark and harmful type of narrative as well. And I did want to ask you if there were other examples that you had found that appear to have these types of problematic dimensions. And you mentioned Q. That's this whole thing that has arisen, this QAnon thing. But that would be another example of it.
Well, I don't know that the Q people, I mean, they're both, that whole thing is part of the cultic milieu, you could say, but it's also not, because it was majorly covered all over the news and they were all inside the White House on their cell phones. And so it's really that's not about as unfringed as you could get being in the White House.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
That whole paradigm is kind of breaking down, but we could still, I think about that these are arising in these sorts of environments, these underground types of environments. And so I don't know, I haven't looked much into Q in connection with the Mandela effect, but you do sometimes find the people talking about it in there. I would imagine they would interpret the Mandela effect more as this government through the tech companies trying to destabilize people, like psychological operation. It's probably the way I would think.
Okay.
They would interpret it that. But,
so this would be more like MK Ultra type of thing?
Stuff like that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And I didn't find anything else. And again, I stopped looking after I wrote the paper, but the places where I thought people could look more is, and I delivered this paper once and someone asked me a really good question about this. And for instance, if someone wanted to look at the figure of Nelson Mandela, why is it centered around Nelson Mandela in the first place? And one could draw interesting conclusions from that and look at the racial dimensions of something like that. In fact, when Lash starts his series, he introduces Mandela as an anti-white Marxist thug kind of a thing. You know what I mean? That's the way he starts the narrative. Right. So you could look at it in that way. But the other one that I wanted to mention here, which is another way you could look at this, is what you brought up earlier about foreign names and the Bernstein Bears. Mm-hmm. Now, when I was researching this, I was, of course, aware that many Jewish people changed their names in order to, get better positions in society and to hide out and things like this when they were facing persecution. Particularly, I'm thinking in like 19th century and early 20th century and stuff like this. Mm-hmm. So I did kind of think about that. I remember when I was first researching this. Well, if you go to the page of this, then we're living in another dimension that I mentioned earlier. That has something like 300 comments on it. It's just it had a lot of discussion at the time. And again, this is I don't know how one would verify this, but it is an interesting development that one of those comments was purported to be the son of Jan and of the authors, the couple who wrote the Berenstain Bears.
Right. So you're talking about Reese's article. Okay.
Yeah, and there's something here that happened actually that let me see if I could bring this up. There's another element to this that I just found, which I hadn't put in the article. So this person posts a comment saying that these are my parents.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is all very interesting what you're saying here about my parents' last name. And here I'll read what he wrote. This is it. I took it from the blog. He says, "I normally don't comment on blogs about our family name, but yours was so unusual and imaginative that I thought it only appropriate to add my thoughts. Berenstain, according to our family lore, was an attempt by an unknown immigration officer sometime in the late 1800s to reproduce phonetically a highly accented version of the traditional Jewish name Bernstein, as pronounced by my father's grandparents when they came to America from the Ukraine. In that linguistic region, the name tended to come out sounding like Bernstein, I can't say it. Anyway, since that's how our name was originally documented, it has always been spelled that way by our family." So he says, great theory, but he brings in this element of the name change for these reasons.
Yeah.
So there's probably more there, that these first two examples do have these racial connotations that one could think about. And I didn't go into that so much in my paper, but I think that there is more there. But so one interesting thing then about this, which is going to get us back to these the Christian interpretation, actually. So then Reese responds and says, "Thank you very much for explaining your etymology. It could just be a Discordian writing this thing. Like, I don't know. We have to take it that it's actually the sun or something, So he treats it as though this is the real person.
Yeah.
He says, "Thanks for explaining the etymology. I have nothing better to say, so I'll just give my condolences on the passing of your mother." The article talks about he noticed the name change when the authors passed away, and he saw kind of an obituary. And that's where he first noticed the spelling change.
Mm.
He says, "Thanks for all the work that they've done." Then he says at the end, he says, "Also, I appreciate the new direction you've taken with the Bears." So apparently the son now writes the Berenstain Bears has taken this over. Okay. He says, "I appreciate the new direction you've taken with the Bears to present the gospel. Ministry to children is an important area. Thanks again." So when I read that, I thought, this is sort of strange. It's a not very Christian blog. It's very scientific science. Maybe the person might be a Christian, I don't know, but it was interesting that was brought up. So I then had to go look to Wikipedia, which I call Operation Wikipedia Mindfuck. We're talking about that on your show. And what do you find there? You find this passage, which I'll read. "Berenstein's father was a secular Jew, and his mother was an Episcopalian. He and his brother were raised in a secular household. Berenstein began investigating Christianity after he married and sent his children to Quaker schools. He was baptized in a Presbyterian church and eventually partnered with an evangelical Christian publishing company to produce religiously themed Berenstain Bears books. For example, the Berenstain Bears say their prayers." So for me, my conspiratorial mind, it all has now come full circle that even the Berenstain Bears are living in the end times, and maybe they have the ME also and think the Antichrist is coming. That
is wild. That is wild.
Yeah, and I hadn't found that before, to be honest. So that was an interesting detail.
Yeah.
But it's sort of a joke, but I think it is interesting. But there is more on the racial, some of the racial elements that other scholars could write about if they were interested.
Okay. Well, this is incredibly interesting. I'm fascinated by all of this stuff. It's
really fascinating.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you brought up the mind fucking and all of that stuff going on with the Discordians. You explore the question of whether or not conspiracy theories are harmful to society, and also note, however, how pop culture shows like the X-Files demonstrate, quote, "a playful, parodic, self-reflective critique of power," end quote. And this playful dimension, referring to housing as homo ludens and the whole concept of ludism and play, how this is serious parody. Play, that this is a characteristic feature of the Discordians. And you mentioned my last podcast episode with Christian Greer when we were talking about that.
Which was great.
Thank you. Erik Davis notes in his book, High Weirdness, that the phrase conspiracy theory wasn't really used or understood culturally until 1964, quote, when it was used by both intelligence agencies and media organizations as a basket term to categorize JFK assassination scenarios that did not support the lone gunman theory adopted by the Warren Commission, end quote. An example of this would be the position that Jim Garrison took when he reopened the case, in particular the idea that the Bavarian Illuminati were somehow behind the assassination of the president. And talk of the Illuminati was also present in the political discourse of the John Birch Society in that time. Christian and I didn't really cover the whole conspiracy aspect in detail. So I'd like to ask if you could elaborate a bit more on what the Discordians were up to with their Operation Mindfuck and how this forced people to question what is real. Also, the second part of the question, do you think this humorous / chaotic way of presenting conspiracy theories with the idea and the attitude of nothing is true, everything is permitted, changed the future of conspiracy theories from that time on, and even perhaps laid the foundation for ME to be a thing?
Yeah, wow, it's a really good question. I'm learning about these Discordians also from both listening to your show, and we talked about the Adam Curtis documentary. Yeah. I do know some about them, but they were just a small part of what I was thinking about with the Mandela effect, and it was mostly to look at the trajectory of conspiracy theory from moving from right wing to left wing and to back again, in a generally speaking. And so the Discordian strand, this ironic conspiracy theorizing and play and parody and sort of doing tricks and pranks to get people to wake up, that this is sometimes thought as to how leftist conspiracy theory looks, and that it sort of culminates in the X-Files in the 90s. Then you had 9/11 happen, and that was a quite a traumatic event that you still then had people questioning the 9/11 account, which were mostly on the left. But when Obama got elected, there was this kind of a sea change here in which conspiracy theory sort of moved more to the right, not totally, but it started to. And then when you have the election of Donald Trump, you can kind of see it all coming out into focus there. I think but it's funny though, because when I say it that way, all those elements are still there. The Discordian elements are sort of on both sides now. And so when your podcast, the last one you had with Christian Greer, he sort of wanted to distance the history of Discordianism from current goings on. And I agree they're different in that one is more after humor and trying to wake people up. But I would probably be a little more skeptical and think there is a kind of direct influence, at least in a sort of cultural setting, that the culture that they helped popularize was in this kind of cultic milieu to a certain extent. And the cultic milieu is now merging with all of these other areas. So I think that those elements are there, not directly from these Discordians, but there is a line of influence that I think we could talk about. And that particularly has to do, if you think about it, with the people who started it, were these sort of Ayn Rand, at the time, libertarian anarchist. And you do find a lot of that type of rhetoric in these in the Q movement as well. So in my opinion, I wouldn't conflate the two, but I would definitely try to say, well, there's a little bit more going on there, I think. But I did have one thing I wanted to say that this made me think of this question. And so when Erik Davis is talking about the beginning of this term conspiracy theory, there is a theory that conspiracy theory was invented by the CIA in the 60s to silence people as a weaponized term, to silence people and to shut them up and like discredit them publicly, something like that. Scholars have been looking at that to see is that true, and where did this theory come from? And it's sort of a debate, honestly. There's no direct evidence to show that the CIA did invent the term, and that the term actually did exist before you could find it. So they clearly didn't invent the term. Okay. But I was looking at this period, and what I found so interesting is, so Hofstadter's essay or a speech that he gave about the paranoid style in American politics. He, in that famous, it was a presentation first before it was published. He gave a lecture, and in that lecture, he talks about how paranoia, this dark paranoia, is a form of American politics and needs to be, it's dangerous. This paranoia, and also that these conspiracy people who are using this paranoia make the leap. He says the leap from the rational to the imaginal, and they sort of make a leap in judgment, and that this turns them into authoritarians and militants, is what he says. So he gave that lecture the day before JFK was assassinated. So that immediately sets up this moment where questioning, it was already kind of a problem. You can look back at the MacArthur area and all this stuff, but it does set up this moment of transition where the idea of conspiracy, being labeled a conspiracy theorist was somehow dangerous and a threat. And this started to all happen around the Warren Commission and particularly around the JFK assassination. But then when you had the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, then it just became more of an issue. Yeah. So there is a document that was released through the Freedom of Information Act in the 70s. And this is usually the document that everyone points to try to say the CIA invented this term. And again, scholars have shown they didn't invent the term, but the document itself, which is Dispatch 1035-960, it's called Concerning Criticism of the Warren Report. And it does go in there to talk about the problem of all of these conspiracy theories, and that it says in there that what we need to do is to start hiring and contacting our propaganda sources in the media and what they call friendly elite contacts, such as like editors and media personalities, to, first of all, put down this kind of rhetoric about these alternative interpretations that the CIA had something to do with the assassination, but also to use to slander basically what they were calling these conspiracy theories are damaging us, and we need to use all of these resources. And one of the things they talk about is using overseas resources, so that if they got someone in the BBC, for example, to critique this, one of their contacts, then they could repost it or republish it in the United States. And this would somehow be like, oh, it's not even coming from us. See, this is coming from we're looking bad in a foreign country. So they did have all these tactics at the time around this to try to deal with this problem. And what I found so interesting about the Discordians is that they also had a similar position, apparently, if we're to believe what we watched in the documentary and what people are writing about the Discordians, that they had a similar position about conspiracy theory, that it was somehow dangerous and needed to be publicly discredited and make the people look foolish. I don't know what to make of that, but I think that there's a connection there. It's more complicated than our understanding of that. The Operation Mindfuck is thought to be just from Robert Anton Wilson, who comes a little bit later. This notion of putting conspiracy theories out into the reality to either to screw with the public, to mess with them, on one hand, to wake them up, apparently, what Robert Anton Wilson calls this guerrilla ontology of like snapping people out of their dreamy, normie reality. But on the other hand, and this is sort of new to me that I'm thinking about, it was also because they wanted to discredit people who believed, these right-wing people who believed, like the John Birch people who believed conspiracy theories. So I think that there's a kind of complex history there that I'm thinking about currently. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I from what I'm learning about, because I'm learning like you are in this period, about Discordian motivations. And I talked about this the last time too, about how Thornley was actually trying to show how ridiculous conspiracy theories were, and how on earth could you even believe in something like that? That there was this Bavarian Illuminati that was still in existence, that was basically controlling everything within the United States government for nefarious purposes. What I'm still learning about is this kind of the prankster element. I wasn't born in the time of JFK, so I don't have a lived experience of that. What I do have a lived experience of is this whole notion of conspiracy theory being dangerous, and people who believe in these types of things, that there's something wrong with you if you believe in that. Because so in a way, I guess, now I'm thinking out loud, but in a way, I guess those ideas that Thornley did try to put forth about how ridiculous this is, even though they were kind of doing it in this playful, spoofy, pranksterish way of just making up these fabulous stories about these groups, and then just making these wild stories out of it. Actually, that does kind of filter down through my lived experience of how I'm looking at conspiracy theory, because I guess my automatic natural response would be like, oh yeah, that's just kind of for people who are a little kooky. So I think it's a very interesting topic, though. It's a very interesting discussion of just what you were talking about, how it's so complex. Actually, there's so many different layers, and you can't just say it's one thing or it's the other thing. But and I think it also has to do with the ideas surrounding hyperstition, and how there are very serious ideas about the nature of reality, and how we actually move through reality, and the notion of time being connected with it, and that fictions are actually not fictions; they're just possible realities. So I'm probably not making any sense whatsoever.
No, it's great.
It's just this. I keep coming back to this idea of the rhizome that Robert Cabrales talks about with me a lot, and I'm getting there. I think I'm starting to get the idea, but conspiracy theories in this case seem to just fit right into that whole notion. And I think for that aspect, it's this idea of what's real and what isn't real. So, and that and
that's the Mandela effect.
Exactly.
Brings that in.
That brings the Mandela effect in. So, and also I think where it kind of goes off onto a different tangent is the notion of memory. And that brings this new element into the discussion. Because, we can talk about, what's real, and there are different levels of reality, and different, some people label that fake, other people label it true. But how we as people remember things, that's different. So...
Well, could I mention one more thing about
this
when we're on the Discordians here?
Yeah.
Because I didn't answer the last part of your question, which I do think there is something to say about the Mandela effect being a thing, partly because of this leftist irony conspiracy strand. And that is the notion of the Operation Mindfuck was to try to wake up the sleeping masses, Right. And the Mandela effect is also about doing that, and they do share it with each other. So, and they like to test people. Like, they will go to their parents. There was even a funny one, actually, now that I'm thinking about this, of a guy who went to the Ford dealership with his cell phone and would ask the guy that were working there, come look at this this Ford symbol. Did you ever notice this little curly Q? To try to see if they would have a sort of moment of basically having their mind blown is the way they would talk about it. I do think, though, that it's not necessarily ironic, although it's a little bit more mixed now. But at any rate, I do think that because of the area in which all of these things are being talked about, this kind of occultic milieu, those discordant elements are in there, and I think do play a part just in the overall way maybe this thing is emerging.
Interesting point. Yeah, I think those Discordians have their fingers in a lot of different places that I didn't even think about before. So yeah, very interesting.
Well, and I of course read The Cosmic Trigger. That was probably one of my first esoteric books that I read. And I did the thing where I went around with the reality tunnels and tried to imagine coins popping up on the ground. And
yeah,
and it does, that whole approach does remind me to a lot of the ways that people experience the internet in connection to having their mind blown and reality changing.
Mm-hmm.
It is sort of similar because it's like you get a thrill out of that, you know.
It is exciting.
That's the fun part.
It is fun. It is kind of a playful thing in that regard. Although that does seem to be kind of like the flip side of the coin, that there is this really serious, almost scary aspect of it as well.
There's a dark side also.
Dangerous, yeah. But with regard to memory that we were talking about before, you wrote in a separate article for the conversation that, quote, those who believe in the Mandela effect are convinced that small details from the past are being altered. Yet you also mentioned that what these people are actually getting at is that in history there really isn't an objective reality, and that, as we were just talking about memory, it's a constructed thing. And, you know, we were just talking about all these different examples of people really thinking that they remember something in a certain way, and that's, you know, different from how they remember it. But this concept of history being created in a way, I'd like you to expand on that, because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and that was a later insight a little bit. When the movie came out, someone approached me from the conversation to write this article for the movie. And in that one, I made it a little bit more of a thing about history rather than so much about looking at the phenomenon the way that I did in the correspondences article. And by that time, it had sort of occurred to me more that I wouldn't so much say that these people are thinking, what the Mandela effect is really about is that history is constructed. I don't think that they're thinking about it in those terms. I think they are really thinking about it in things are changing. Oh my God, I'm freaking out. I'm experiencing both wonder and terror at the same time, so it's exciting and scary, like you said. What do I do about that? You know, reality shifting. Then they start to theorize. But a byproduct of that, or like a result of that process, is what I wanted to say in the paper, is that this then brings up the idea that, because they look back in history at historical events as well and find ones they've never heard of before, which this is the question of ignorance versus, you know, so, but either way, it has the effect of something that I talk about in this piece that the historians are already talking about and have talked about, that, you know, history is an agreed upon thing that is constructed out of a very small number of known things, if you know, and it has to be, it's constructed frequently in a culturally contingent way. So there are a lot of elements that make it constructed. But my point in that piece was that the historians, of course, talk about that, and scholars, but your everyday people don't normally think about it in those terms. But that the Mandela effect forces at least some version of a recognition of that. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because to a certain extent, it's both exciting. I think it would be exciting, but it also has destabilizing. I mean, an overall argument of this whole Mandela effect research is related to technology and information technology in particular, and how it can have a damaging effect to the psyche. And so if you're destabilized and then are ready to restabilize yourself in a new way, which John Lam Lash has done this.
Yeah.
Great, then you're fine, sort of. But a lot of people don't have that and don't think about it in those terms. So they just sort of get hit with all of these elements, and then it's a sort of destabilizing thing.
Yeah. Right.
So if I think about my larger argument, it was more about it is more about technology, advanced information technology, and the kind of mental psychic effects that it can have. And that's why I brought in the stuff about memory being also constructed. That I mean, people are now talking about this, but overall, I would think that there was the internet and the way we're using it and the technology the way it functions. I don't think that, to a certain extent, people understood the level of effect that it would have on the way people think and the way people experience the world, and also the affective and the nervous system. And I can't remember if it's in this article or in my dissertation, I'm talking about technology a lot, and I talk about the introduction of trains in Europe in the 19th century, and that with the introduction of trains, they had to start describing new forms of mental illness. And some of these were about fears about being on the train when it crashes. This produced a new kind of neurosis. In fact, the term neurosis starts to get coined right around this time with people being afraid of trains. So it's a kind of my point with that is that there is a direct psychological and physical and mental well-being aspect to the introduction of new technology that is not always taken into account. And so when I think about Mandela effect people, I'm sympathetic in that whatever is going on, part of what's going on is all of this is being done on Google. For the most part. This is an interaction with the technology that is producing these, either destabilizing in either a wonderful or a horrible way. I mean, that can kind of go either ways. I mean, deconstruction is both a good thing, it can be, but you do have to then reconstruct. But that's not always a good thing, because we could look at the John Lamb Lash reconstruction out of that as an example. So that's my sort of larger sociological, I think, interest in the whole thing.
Okay. There was one other thing that I wanted to ask you about with regard to memory, is that you discussed recalling a past event is actually creating a new experience, and how our present can be influenced by the future then in this regard. And this is not something that I recognized what it was that you were talking about, but I didn't realize that that's what I was doing. So if you can give an example of what you mean by that, how you're creating new experiences by thinking of past, and then how that is influenced by the future. Because this is really hyperstitional in my opinion, but I didn't really think of it in these practical terms.
Right. And these are neurologists talking about it. I mean, I delved into the realm where humanities scholars are not supposed to go, and I pulled out the neurologists and what scientists are saying about this. And my point with that was to talk about, really just to show that the complexity of memory, but also the constructed nature of memory. So these neurologists talk about the whole point of memory research, which actually starts in Germany. In the 19th century, there was a German psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus, and he had this idea that memories were new things rather than stored things being reproduced, being represented. And then there was one of his students published a book in 1932 called Remembering, a Study in Experimental and Social Psychology. And in this book, it says, the memory appears to me to be an affair of construction rather than reproduction. So this is where this idea kind of starts, but it's basically accepted for the most part that when a person has a memory, they aren't pulling up an old exact copy of something that happened to them. In fact, they're reconstructing it new and having a new experience on the affective and the intellectual level. So I pointed that out just to show that, to think that people are not remembering things right is not just that they can't put in the right VHS that everyone else can put in or something. There's a larger phenomenon taking place there. That was sort of my point of that part of it. But these guys also then highlight that memory is important because the memory is able to, this aspect of human consciousness is able to be in the present, but also travel into the past to revisit memories and then call them up. And it's also, there's this notion of future memory that I talked about. And this is what they call the autonoetic consciousness is one way that one scholar talks about it this way, that this part of our consciousness can look and have a memory about what could happen in the future, as though it did happen. And then we can actually we would adjust and respond in the present based on something that never happened in the future that we're just sort of imagining could happen. And that this interplay between future remembering, past remembering, which is not really remembering, it's just constructing things, and then experiencing the present and the sensory data in the present is a much more complex and generative process. It's not a kind of static process that I think people sometimes maybe would assume it is. And so in my mind, that makes the Mandela effect even more interesting and more important for trying to understand like what is going on currently with
right.
There's a lot of people, millions of people are watching this on YouTube, this stuff about the Mandela effect. And I think one of the things I wanted to say about that was in the paper, I then go from this memory work into Kevin Kelly and talking about the hive mind. Kevin Kelly is a famous technologist who is interested in how technology could create a hive mind. And that's about the hive mind is where all data is stored. All memories of everything is stored in the hive mind. So I tried to bring in this complication between human memory versus digital memory. And perhaps that's a little bit a way to think about what's going on. One of the aspects, this kind of social aspects of the Mandela effect, the encounter between human memory and digital memory, the Google memory or something.
Okay. So how would that look then?
Yeah, well, because the Mandela effect E person has a memory of the way a movie was, and they have there's nothing reason why they should doubt that.
Okay. Of
course, it is possible you could run into someone on the street who has seen the movie also, and then you say, "Hey, remember this great line?" And then they say, "That's not the way the line ever was." And then you'd have to go, "Okay, now I remember it being this way." And you can go ask however many people you could get to. Let's say if we're saying there's no internet is what I'm talking about here. You could ask 20 people, "Hey, do you remember this line?" And then get various answers. That isn't the way things are happening, though. The way things are happening is the person has a memory, and the way they get the answer, the validation of the knowledge, is through the collected hive mind.
Yes.
And Kevin Kelly's point is that when something new, the hive mind is a thing, and it's always mutating and expanding. And the way he talks about it is he says that all books, all knowledge, eventually all pictures, everything will be sort of digitized and put in this hive.
Right. Okay.
So if you're a person who doesn't have the same view as the hive, and you're then you check yourself against the hive, you would get the notice does not conform with community standards or something like you get on YouTube. But what Kevin Kelly says that's interesting is the person who is then can introduce new things into the hive mind that then sort of changes the hive mind itself.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, though, my main point was, just to think about the way that the Mandela effect goes down is through people checking their own memory against the internet memory. That's my main point there. And that's an interesting dynamic.
That's clear now. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because before that technology, how would you check it? You'd have to maybe go to a library,
right?
Look at books.
God forbid. Yeah.
Or talk with other people to test their memory. But this whole notion of false memory is, that's a completely different topic that we can't get into right now. But that is also probably at play here with
Definitely.
A lot of examples of ME. So I kind of looked into the sciencey side as well when I was looking at possible reasons why people might be believing in this type of thing. And some of the literature on the psychology behind this claims that people may be drawn to conspiracy theories because they fulfill certain psychological motives, such as reducing uncertainty, finding meaning or finding patterns, or exerting control over their environment and therefore feeling more secure. Additionally, early research suggests that belief in conspiracy theories is part of our evolutionary process geared toward detecting dangerous alliances. So that's kind of like hardwired in us to
Right.
be on the lookout for shady groups that, might be wanting to do something bad to us. So regarding the psychological motives, however, the research doesn't indicate that these beliefs actually fulfill people's motivations. So that's not really getting any reward from it, as far as the research is now showing. And Micheal Barkun states that, quote, the popularity of conspiracy films, for example, does not inevitably translate into a feeling of empowerment for conspiracy theorists, end quote. Because the conspiracy theory may come across as banal or ridiculous, or it may leave some feeling as if the dark, evil, secret forces will win in the end. So what's the use of fighting against it? They're too powerful. So how do you think these types of arguments apply to ME in particular? And do the people who believe in ME fall into these categories? Because I'm kind of wondering about that myself. And if they don't fall into these categories, then what is the reward for the people that believe in ME?
Yeah, no, thanks. And thanks for sending me those articles too, because I hadn't read that yet. It is really interesting to think about conspiracy theory from this sort of evolutionary biology or psychology point of view. And when I presented here in Erfurt on the Mandela Effect, someone asked me this question, I think, well, what is the reward? Probably, I think the person had also read Barkun's book and was asking me, what is the reward for these people? Because it's not as clear cut, because you can find people who are get freaked out and destabilized from conspiracy theories, and they're not feeling empowered by them. Although you could then argue that, okay, maybe they get to feel empowered in a sort of knowledge-y way. But in terms of survival techniques, I don't know how helpful that is, because you get sort of cut off from the group, So on the one hand, yes, I could see how we could be thought of as a survival mechanism, but I would probably point more towards the satisfying wonder and terror activity. I think there's a thrill involved in part of this whole thing. And the Mandela Effect it is exciting also and scary. That's the thrill part, to find all these things and find the world being different from these misremembered, or things that are not the way you remembered them. And there's a great book on P.T. Barnum about in the United States, about people going to the P.T. Barnum shows to try to figure out the trick that was being put on. And that in this book, I can't remember the name of the scholar who wrote it. It's a good book, but he uses a term for this that he calls the operational aesthetic, meaning that there's a sort of aesthetic feeling and an appreciation and a satisfying thing to try to understand the operations behind the trick. And this sort of makes the argument that this is kind of part of American culture, that they get a kick out of wanting to figure out how they're being duped, So maybe there's something there we could think about. But if I think about just the Mandela Effect, I think that people have legitimate experiences of disruption in their psyche, or in the way it is a sort of traumatic thing, in my opinion, to sort of find out all these things are wrong. They then manage that traumatic feeling by finding a bunch of other people who agree with them, and then also sort of forming communities and talking about it. And then they start to interpret and create a whole kind of world out of this original kind of traumatic experience.
Yeah.
I think people would find scholars, I'm hearing certain scholars I know in my head who would take issue with this and say, if a person's wrong, factually, it doesn't mean that they've been traumatized. It just means that they're ignorant, and that's what learning is. You learn what you don't know, and you just go on. You haven't been traumatized. But I don't know. There's a certain way that this goes down, and I think the internet, again, is part of it, where it is a sort of traumatic thing. And probably because it has to do with memory, rather than just purely going to school to learn a bunch of facts or something. And if in the memory research that I did, he talks about these neurologists talk about memory, the way a person knows that it's the right memory they've picked out when they say, I want to remember what happened when I was 10 and at grandma's house or something, is there's a certain flavor to it. So it has this very subjective quality to whether or not you know it's the right memory. And it's both affective, it's intuitive, it has a lot of these other elements. And so I think when that is disrupted in a certain way through this, in the way it's being disrupted, I think it is, because if you watch their videos, they are excited, but also freaked out. In fact, they say they're freaked out a lot. They just say it over and over.
Well, yeah, you're questioning your own. How would
like
you
mental
call it?
abilities,
Yeah, your own mental
health or
ability.
something.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like, am I going crazy here? If I can't remember things, but people might think that there's something wrong with them. Then, if I don't remember this correctly, is there something wrong? So it is kind of I understand what you mean by it being somewhat traumatic, because you're questioning your own idea of what's real. You're questioning your the function of your brain. Is there something wrong with you? Do you have some kind of disease or that makes you not be able to remember things correctly? I mean, these are things that you can, draw lines to, like dementia and Alzheimer's. There are diseases that are linked with not being able to remember things.
Exactly,
so
right.
I think it does instill kind of a fear in people, like, oh, wait a minute. So I think there is a difference there between just not knowing something as just factual knowledge, and then thinking you do know something, thinking you remember it, and then finding out that that's not the way it was. So I think you make a good point there.
Yeah, and that's why I find the Mandela Effect maybe more, why I focused on it, even though there's a million conspiracy theories out there right now that are all interesting for various reasons. I spent the most time with the Mandela Effect, partly because of all of these things that swirl around it that are so much more than just conspiracy theory.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
In fact,
go ahead. Sorry.
Most Mandela Effect people don't like it being called conspiracy theory, by the way.
I could understand.
Call it that.
Yeah, I could understand that. Yeah, it does seem to be more than.
And different, yeah.
Just a quote-unquote conspiracy theory. So...
This is another thing I found out in preparation for this thing. So this is why I wanted to tell you it. And this is about the science fiction connection. So I did know that this franchise existed, but I went and looked at it again because we were going to talk. And so I just want to mention this as another interesting part of the Mandela Effect, if I can find it in my notes here. This is another element that people could look at, which I didn't go too much into this, but the fact that it started at a science fiction fantasy convention about alternative history and really does have a big role in the fantasy science fiction world. Some people have pointed this out also, that there's a series of it was a manga, it was a video game, and it was a TV series and films called Steins Gate. Have you ever heard of this?
I haven't.
And this came out in 2009. And basically, the plot is the Mandela Effect.
Oh.
And the main character learns how to time travel and shift timelines. And so this person can shift to different timelines. And but normally when you shift to these different timelines, you lose your memory. So this person has the ability to remember when they've shifted to timelines, what was happening in the past timeline. And the enemy, when the enemy organization in this that finds out that this person can do this and then comes after them, is named CERN, but spelled with an S. So in a lot of ways, it is a very, like, wherever this is coming from, this whole thing, like I told you where people say it came from this conference and all this. I mean, that plot of that series, and when I taught a religion and science fiction class at UC Davis, and I assigned that to we talk about the Mandela Effect in my class, and I had students read this Steins Gate thing. And so we all talked about it, how many similarities there are with this. But there's one thing that I didn't notice until just now, that the way that the main character is able to remember the stuff from the old memories from the other timeline is through a process that he calls reading Steiner. Oh. And because I'm spending all my time writing on Rudolf Steiner and reading Rudolf Steiner, I was like, what? So, it's very strange.
So, and is this the literal reading of
No, Steiner? I don't think it has anything to do with Rudolf Steiner.
It doesn't, I don't know what the heck it means. But he just calls it that. Oh, yeah, wow.
Reading Steiner.
That is fun. That sounds very interesting. And it's called, what is it called?
It's called Steins Gate.
Steins Gate.
It is worth spending some time with because it really, it somehow plays a part in this whole thing because it's quite in a lot of ways, the exact plot of the Mandela Effect.
So this was, am I understanding correctly that this was created before the Mandela Effect became a thing?
Yeah, 2009.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It was an Xbox game.
Here we have rhizomes and hyperstition again, I guess.
Yes.
Fun. Okay. Well, before we close, may I ask if you could talk a little bit more about the book that you've edited and will soon be publishing? Because you are also a writer and an editor in fantasy, horror, sci-fi, those genres, correct?
That's true.
Okay. So
you found me out.
I did a little Googling myself, so
yes.
using that technology. But what is this book about?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning it. I think it would relate actually to a lot of people who listen to your podcast. And so it's a fiction, dark fantasy, horror, dark fantasy story. It's not really science fiction, but it's called There Is No Death, There Are No Dead. And it's co-edited by myself and Jess Laundrie, she's also an editor and fiction writer in horror fiction and supernatural fiction. And we collaborated to co-edit this book. And the theme is spiritualism. So all the stories that we've got from people the main character will either be a medium or it'll take place in a setting where spiritualism is going on, but it will incorporate some of the history of spiritualism as well. So I think it's like about 12 stories from some really great well-known science fiction and horror and supernatural fiction authors that we got for this thing, and they will all be writing about spiritualism.
Oh, that sounds really fun. But I mean, this is fiction, though, correct?
Yeah, all
wink,
fiction.
Wink.
Yep. Yes, right. But in about 10 years, it will be real. So just get ready.
Exactly. Okay, and when is this going to be published? When do you expect it?
It's being published by Crystal Lake. And I think which is a reference to Friday the 13th films. I don't know if you know that, but yeah, so it'll be published by this publisher, I think, in this fall.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so we have a Facebook page. You can look it up. It's There Is No Death, There Are No Dead.
Okay, I will be sure to include all of that in the program notes for this episode.
Thank you.
One other question: where can people find you?
You can find me on Facebook. I have both an author page and then my personal page, and then I don't do much Twittering things, although I do have a Twitter handle. But you could look at my Academia.edu. A lot of my writing is on there. But if you're interested in my fiction, which is not the research, that would be to go to my Facebook page. And I also just started. I will now plug myself. I just started making music again because we're all at home with lots of time to become more talented. So I've started to record music, and I've made a SoundCloud page and also a Bandcamp, I think it's called, page so I'm now releasing sort of electronic and acoustic, mystically music.
Nice.
Yeah.
And that's under your own name?
Yeah, if you look up Aaron J. French, you'll find all that.
French. Okay, I will include that too. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. I learned a lot more about this Mandela Effect that I hadn't, of course, known about beforehand. My kind of initial reaction, I guess, when I first heard about this, years ago, was just to kind of think, oh, that's just one of those funny things, that. But I'm really happy to have been able to talk to you about it and read your work about it, because it's a lot more complex than what you would just first think about it. So, and there's so many different links to so many different areas as well that, I thought it would just be a very, not only fun, but very informative, very interesting discussion to have. So I'm really thankful that you agreed to talk to me.
Yeah.
So,
wonderful. And thank you for inviting me also, but to talk about this subject, because it is a lot of fun, and just to discuss it with someone who knows about all of these similar areas, I think is really productive and helps me think through the whole thing. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I had a really great time.
Me too.
My thanks again to Aaron for such a wonderful discussion. Please check out my social media and the program notes for links to Matthew Dillon's dissertation that covers the John Lamb Lash content, and also for the links to Steins Gate, Aaron's author page on Facebook where you can keep up to date with his new book, There Is No Death, There Are No Dead, his Academia.edu page, Aaron's music outlets, and a fun website to test your own Mandela effects. Additionally, as Aaron is in Erfurt now and working with the Religious Studies department there, he'd like to share that applications are now open for their English language master program with a deadline of July 15. The link to the university website can be found on my social media pages. I hope you've enjoyed this month's episode, and as always, thanks for listening.